More Christ is sponsored by Sheer Blooms. Sheer Blooms is a flower preservation specialist. If you live in Britain or Ireland and wish to have your flowers preserved for special occasions, then please follow the details on your screen. My thanks to my friends over in Patreon. I appreciate your continued support. If you'd like to join us in the More Christ community, you'll receive a number of perks, including early access to new episodes, patron-only videos. You'll be able to ask More Christ guests some of your questions. You'll receive free ebooks online, and you'll also be able to get discount for in-person events. If you join me in the higher tier, then you'll be able to receive further perks, including courses that I'll be offering via my Patreon, including one on storytelling and another on spiritual disciplines in a secular age. Thank you again, and I hope to see some of you join our community.
Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by Gary Chartier. Gary is a legal scholar, philosopher, political theorist, and theologian. Amongst other things, his work addresses libertarianism, anarchy, and ethics. He's a professor and serves as Associate Dean of La Sierra University's Business School, California, in the USA. And so Gary and I actually had a conversation before, which was splendid, but unfortunately, due to a technical error, the file was lost, and we focused on his work on anarchy and things like that, political questions. But this conversation, we decided we're going to home in a little bit more on distinctly theological questions, and I thought that there's a lot of work that he's done that will be apropos to viewers and listeners in this channel. And so, with that all in mind, I suppose first, Gary, how did you come to the Christian faith then, and how does it inform your work?
Yeah, so I came to Christian faith in the context of a vibrantly active Christian home life with parents who were not only active participants in church life, but also themselves took worship and prayer seriously, and who were intermittently involved in church-related activities outside the context of weekly services. So I grew up as somebody for whom that was a very live part of my experience, and pretty formative for me from the very beginning. So I was part of a community, still am part of a community practicing adult baptism, but the reality is that really I was an engaged participant in that community really from as early as I can remember. So I grew up praying and worshiping and reflecting. And so, while I had other kinds of interests, because I'm a dilettante and I find myself intrigued by all sorts of different things, really trying to reflect carefully on the the context of my Christian belief and practice really became important for me early on. I would say by late adolescence, I was starting to find myself really quite captivated by theological questions. And so, even though I actually started out initially as an undergrad thinking I was going to focus mainly in political philosophy, those theological questions were very natural for me to pursue because they involve trying to make sense of a way of being in the world that had been extremely important for me from the very beginning of my life.
That's powerful. Thank you, Gary. And I suppose, are there a few influences or any in particular that you would like to focus on who've been especially important for your formation, for example?
Well, I love that kind of question. I just don't know how to keep the answer short enough because
Yeah.
I really have learned so much from so many wise and thoughtful people over so many years. So I can think about people who were, for instance, my undergraduate teachers, a wonderful practitioner of Christian ethics and the sociology of religion, Charles Teal, Rick Rice, who did philosophical and doctrinal theology, Fritz Guy, who again did doctrinal and philosophical theology, continued to be a hugely important figure in my life. In graduate school, certainly people, including my dissertation advisor, Brian Hebblethwaite. But then, people I read, from early on, whether those were people offering insights into Christian spirituality like Henry Nouwen, or people doing theology, ranging from the great kind of 20th century Anglican theologian and friend of C.S. Lewis, Austin Farrer, to the premier post-World War II Lutheran theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg, the I think really outstanding Roman Catholic thinker Karl Rahner, and also Nicholas Lash, another Catholic thinker who was a professor at Cambridge when I was a student there. Among later Anglicans after Farrer, one might think of Keith Ward, the Reformed thinker Karl Barth, philosophers doing things related to religion, certainly including people in the Dutch Reformed tradition, like Nick Walterstorff and Alvin Planting. I mean, I can just keep wandering down many different rabbit holes there, because I've learned so much from so many wonderful people.
Oh, that's excellent. A long but distinguished list. And your work distills some of the key themes in them beautifully. And I thought that comes out today. So basically, the work that I wanted to focus on today, which I think ties so many things that I'm interested in together, is the analogy of love, divine and human love at the center of Christian theology, which I have in the first edition in the paperback, but is also being updated with the second edition, so people can get that. And basically, to frame it, partly why I'm so interested is there's been a lot of talk about things like the Logos recently, and I think that's all great. And I've had conversations with different people who show how the Christian faith fulfills ancient Greek traditions and so on. And I think your work does, alongside that, points to another central focus, namely love, which is vital. And well, as I said, the logos has its place. There's also the need to focus centrally in those things like agape and eros. And I think it takes theology out of its dry, overly academic or intellectual little cloister, and brings it to people in a way that they can resonate with. So I suppose with that said, what moved you to write this book, and what do you ultimately hope that readers will take away from it then, Gary?
Sure. I'm so intrigued that you've been having the conversations you've been having regarding the idea of the logos, because I think that's such a powerful and evocative idea, and perhaps it's one we can come back to. You know, as regards how I came to write this book, here's the reality. Sometimes things happen that we're not really planning on. So when I first drafted this book, it really emerged from, at the same time as, and partly as an expansion of notes for a largely undergraduate course in Christian theology that I taught. It was actually the very first course that I taught after finishing my PhD, though I'd written some of the book before that. But I'd originally decided that the organizing principle for the book was going to be the Apostles' Creed. I was inspired there by Nicholas Lash, whom I mentioned earlier, who made a reference at one point in a conversation to that book on the creed that every theologian writes by age 60. And I was a little younger than that, but I thought it might be worth doing. And so I organized the book that way. And it really sat on my shelf unpublished for a long time through the 90s. And I did some rewriting. And at some point, and I have to think about when exactly, but at some point, I was reading the German Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann's Theology of Hope. And Moltmann talks there about what he sees, perhaps too conveniently as a kind of tripartite division in the history of Christian theology. A long time ago, we wrote theologies of love, and then in the Reformation era, we began to focus on faith as the dominant theme, and now it's time to talk about hope. And I thought, well, I sure don't recall very much that's really concerned with love. And it was really Moltmann kind of prompting me to reflect on that. And so I thought, great. I went back and recast this small-scale systematic theology I'd already written, not around the Apostles' Creed, which probably was more interesting to some readers than others. I recast it instead around the theme of love, and then returned to the task of communicating with publishers about it. So, but it really was a matter of I had these ideas, but I reorganized how I presented them in light of this aha moment that happened when I had that encounter with Moltmann, and that's really how the book came to take the form that it did.
Excellent, thank you, Gary. And I suppose, what then does it mean to approach the way of flow from a distinctly Christian perspective, in contrast to maybe more popular notions, this more sentimental view of love? And even in Tom Holland's Dominion, he talks about how the Christian Revolution impacted all these things, down to the Beatles, all you need is love, and so on. But we lose those distinctions and the theological milieu, which that is properly nested in. I wonder if you might speak to that.
Sure. So yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? That theology impacts the culture. Ideas impact the culture in a whole range of ways, but it's very easy, and not just with respect to theological ideas, but with regard to a whole range of other ideas as well that ramify out in the culture, they can lose their initial moorings, and so that original context may be less evident, and there may be things that are missing after a while because of that. On the other hand, I suppose it's important to emphasize that when, say, early Christians found themselves talking about love, if they had been talking about something that was utterly alien to their listeners and readers, what they said wouldn't have made any sense, right? I mean, if you're going to use the language of love, it needs to have some kind of anchor, I suppose, in the language that people are already employing, or it's not going to be comprehensible. You can't say, it's just not very helpful at any rate to say, well, when I talk about love, I mean making peanut butter sandwiches, right? So I think there's a kind of back and forth, therefore, it seems to me, between the cultural inheritance that informs the language that, let's say, early Christians and then medieval Christians use, and then the theological reflection, the moral reflection that they do, that then feeds back into and shapes the way the language is being used, which in turn feeds back into the way theological formulations are put together. And I think there's an ongoing oscillation there that probably unavoidably has to happen in terms of trying to frame things. So when I thought about this, particularly in putting together the initial draft of Analogy of Love, I had in mind a kind of probably oversimplified typology. And I think that, my friends and colleagues who have demonstrated some expertise in the history of ideas and in the development of 20th century theology would, I'm sure, want to caution me against being too glib here. But I think you have a kind of stereotypical framing, let's say, in which there's the analogy of being juxtaposed with the analogy of faith. in which the idea is that on the one hand, we construct an idea of God out of what's needed to make sense of contingent to finite being, or on the other hand, we proceed on the basis of treating foundationally what's disclosed in Christ. And what I tried to suggest was that an analogy of love, as opposed to these other alternatives, might be an interesting way of bridging the gap, insofar as it is clearly the tradition as a whole, and certainly what Christians remember of Jesus, that makes love so central to Christian discourse. But on the other hand, the love that is central to Christian discourse doesn't exist in some kind of theological vacuum, and does have a connection with people's experiences more broadly. And so I hoped that this idea of the analogy of love as a kind of central key to doing theology might help to bring together disparate ways of thinking. And so, I spent some time reflecting, both in this book, but also in my more recent book, that's more narrowly focused on Christian ethics, book called Loving Creation, on how Christians have thought about love. And there's been a dominant strand, I don't know, certainly an influential strand in the last, 150 years of Christian thinking about these matters, that's been profoundly influenced and certainly exemplified, right, by the work of the Swedish philosopher of religion Anders Nygren, whose book Agape and Eros argued that you could clearly distinguish between these two sort of types or themes in intellectual and cultural history, and that as a good Lutheran, he wanted to suggest that language of agape is about the language of utterly unqualified grace, the language of eros about sort of striving and desire and need. And Nygren was very influential, but I think it's fair to say he was most influential on people who didn't know the classical sources well. And that for people who did know the classical sources well, it wasn't nearly as obvious that there was the kind of sharp distinction that he had in mind, whether in Greek texts, classical Greek texts themselves, or, for instance, in the Septuagint, with its rendering of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The way in which the words get used there, and thus probably the way in which they would have been used by the New Testament authors, just doesn't seem to track this kind of sharp distinction that Nygren is interested in making. That didn't keep a number of people from building whole careers, I think, in the 20th century, especially on this model that had been laid out, this kind of sharp distinction between two varieties of love, enough so that it filtered down. I remember to a sermon that I can remember hearing as a kid, but I just don't think finally that that's probably what's really going on in the biblical materials. Are there differences in tone or nuance that might be there? Possibly, but it seems to me that love, the different Greek words for love probably have more in common with each other than we have sometimes more recently thought. And again, I think this highlights the connection between these words that we use on the one hand because of their, as it were, authorization, within the tradition, but on the other hand, words that are authorized with sort of pre-existing flavors that come into play. So anyway, a long answer to your question. Happy to talk more about that as needed.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. And I think I first came across, had that deconstructed for me, that strict dichotomy by Father Ed Vacek's book on love, which was really interesting. And also, I think you said even when you read someone like Rabbi Jonathan Sacks on the Old Testament, and that fits better once you see it in the ancient Hebrew and everything with what you're describing on this kind of crude dichotomization. So
Yeah.
I think that's really good, and I think it has practical implications too, for how we live. So people should take these things seriously. And actually, I suppose in line with that, I want to talk about hopeful love specifically, and sort of give a bit of a frame. Deeply in my own life, I was deeply impressed by the historian Christopher Lash, who wrote The True and Only Heaven. And it was really that book of his which helped me to wrestle with this notion of hope, I suppose, in contrast to kind of simple optimism and what that means. He went from this more psychological perspective to an increasingly distinctly theological perspective, at least implicitly. And I was really moved by that and his work, and it helped change my life, the whole way I could conceive politics and everything. And I think your work will hopefully help others to do the same. So I wanted to ask about those two great theological virtues outside of religion, as we've bracketed it, in secularism, and the relationship between them, and what is the form of a hopeful love then?
Yeah. So there's a dance, it seems to me, or a tightrope walk. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is exactly, but what I think we want to avoid, there are two things we want to avoid. On the one hand, I think we want to avoid a kind of glib, naive confidence that we know exactly when and how things are going to turn out, and that they're going to turn out just the way we want, and so forth, and that within history we know that some particular moment is going to have a certain kind of outcome. Austin Farrer talks somewhere about what he sees as a deficient view of providence, one in which I can't think how he starts the phrase, but it ends with, the whole series of providences all leading to lollipops for me. And, that kind of view obviously doesn't work. And it's going to be profoundly dispiriting, right? Because, we find over and over again that we expect, if we expect that things are going to turn out in just the way we want them to, when they don't, then it can become very easy to blame God, to regard, our trust in God as misplaced, and so forth. So that's one thing to avoid, I think, again, is this kind of naive, glib optimism. On the other hand, to believe that that God is real and present and active, to believe that, as Martin Luther King says, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, I think is to believe, therefore, that it's not warranted either just to kind of give up and expect that the way things are going to play out is just however they in fact, will play out. And there's nothing to be said about where our lives are going, where history is going. So I think it's really important to find a path between those two, as it seems to me, mistaken possibilities, between kind of resigned or even nihilistic despair on the one hand and a kind of glib optimism on the other. To believe, so I think Christianity throughout its history really does involve the anticipation of positive change for both history and for individual lives. I think it has been a mistake for some 20th century figures who seems to me have been so kind of put off by again a kind of cocky assurance about exactly how things are going to play out, that they've really wanted to let go of any sort of eschatological hope. I think that's been a mistake. But what's important is to recognize that we don't know things, and when you encounter a preacher who assures you that, look, here's a list of all the things that are going to happen in the next 7 years. I think the right response to that is, you might be right, but I have no particular reason to think you are. It's just not the way things work. So it's really what I try to do in the book is to seek to explain how it might be possible to walk in that space between those two alternatives, both in the discussion, and it's organized a bit differently in the second edition, which is the one I'm thinking about, especially now where there's discussion of issues related to this in the chapter on salvation, but then in that final chapter on hopeful love in both editions. It seems to me that integral to belief in the goodness and love of God is belief that there is hope beyond death, and belief in divine providence means that there is ongoing pressure, shall we say, toward growth and healing and liberation and transformation. Pick your favorite words here, within history. So with regard to hope beyond death, there are various things you can say, but one sort of simple, crisp thing I tend to want to say is that if we believe that God is love, then we have to also believe that many things that happen are contrary to God's intentions. We can't embrace a kind of view, to use, I'm not sure who originated this phrase, I certainly didn't, but a belief in meticulous providence in accordance with which everything that happens is just what ought to happen. Many things that happen are contrary to God's intentions. And to create a world that's real and not just a kind of puppet show is to create a world where that's a live possibility. But if that's the case, then there are going to be many instances of profound loss. And if that's right, then unless we are to suppose that God, just kind of dismissively accepts those losses, built into the fabric of things has to be the possibility of more, has to be the possibility of hope. So for it to be realistic, for it to be appropriately consistent with a real belief in divine love, for there to be the failures and the stumblings and the real losses that occur, there also has to be, I think, this possibility of hope, and I think that's not only a way of squaring what happens with divine love, but it's a natural expression of divine love. If God creates, then we can see hope for creatures beyond death as a matter of hope for continued relation between God and those creatures. And then within history, hope within history, I would say, again, is a function of what it is to believe in love, and therefore in an account of divine providence to which love is central. So if God's presence and ongoing movement in history reflect God's love for creation, there are lots of different directions that history can take that are consistent with responsiveness to divine love, but you certainly expect some things at the macro level to represent genuine forward movement. Right. I mean, I think so. I don't know whether you're familiar with the work of René Girard, the French cultural critic, and so for Girard, there's the idea, it seems to me, that the image of Jesus as the truly innocent victim, the recognition that social systems that seem credible and that are there to maintain social order and so forth, that we might at first blush think of as on the right side, turn out to be those institutions that crucify the innocent Jesus. That I think Girard very plausibly suggests serves to recast how we think about victimhood and victimization and so forth in our culture, and that's had ramifications that are continuing to play out. It's not that there's a change overnight because of that, but if we look at how things develop in a range of related contexts, if we look at everything from how we might view, torturous punishments like crucifixion, to how we view the relative perspectives of victim and victimizer in our kind of public discourse, what we see is centuries of change occurring in light of what happens there in first century Palestine. So, however, that is just one example. History, it's not about histories being changed overnight, but it is about dynamics changing within history over time. So I think there's reason to hope in that way for history as well as for somehow for individuals.
No, that's excellent. And there's been a lot of conversation on the internet about that recently with civilizational Christianity and Ayaan Hirsi Ali's conversion, motivated in part by Tom Holland's Dominion and so on. So I think your work comes in at that angle too in really interesting ways. And I suppose from my context in Ireland, growing up in the church, which had a dominant Christendom model, so to speak, it was very prepositional and it was sort of taken for granted, and this is what we all believe and so on. A lot of that was dry and didn't resonate with me. I wanted a kind of call to adventure, so to speak, and I think a lot of young people in Ireland are drawn to the political left in part for that reason. There's a lot of Marxism in the north, especially as post-colonial too. There's many reasons for that, but there's that kind of pragmatic let's get out and do something element, which a lot of Christianity, like you said before, an influential stream is missing, just focusing on prepositions about you have to believe this thing, and once saved, always saved, and so on. There's not this emphasis on sanctification and all this stuff, and which I've learned more about through John Wesley and folks like that as I've went on. But I suppose just if you might speak to that a little bit, and the relationship between belief and action, and what a more integrated Christian perspective might be in that regard.
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's been a profound error when many different Christian communities have seen the embrace of particular ideas as offering some kind of ticket to divine favor, right? That feels to me like a real mistake. So that, somebody who says, well, here's this element of the creed or the catechism that doesn't make sense to me, and because it doesn't, I guess that means I'm not an insider. I don't have the golden ticket, and I feel like that's just profoundly wrong-headed. So I do theology because I think that in several different ways beliefs matter, but they don't matter as ways of getting God to love us. If they matter, they matter insofar as it's important for us to kind of understand where we are in the world, to situate our lives in relation to a cosmic story, in relation to what God is up to in the world. And those beliefs can help to shape not only our self-understanding as individuals, but our communal self-understanding and our practice and so forth. So I think, I think belief matters, but we can't begin by assuming that it matters in the sense that, getting a set of propositions right is somehow how we are in right relation to God. One source of difficulty here, right, has been that words like faith and belief carry a range of meanings, right? And so it's not that I think belief in the sense of, again, of understanding and accepting particular ideas is worthless or unimportant. I wrote this book trying to argue for particular ideas. But I think if you're going to talk about what matters existentially, first and foremost, I don't think it's belief or faith as a matter of embracing particular propositions. It's belief or faith as trust, and I think the language of trust probably helps to get us away from some of the kind of, as it seems to me, unhelpful connotations of some of the other words. One of the people who continues to be profoundly influential on me really is the now deceased theological ethicist and philosopher of religion, Jack Pravancha, who drew, I think, very helpfully on the idea, which we find in certain strands of, say, of psychology, of basic trust. The idea, and Pannenberg talks about this at something like this. Well, basic trust being the idea that a sense of a kind of fundamental groundedness of one's life, a sense that that one is rooted and grounded. That Pravancha sometimes said the universe is a friendly place. Doesn't mean there aren't awful things that happen, but it means that who one is, whether one's life has meaning and value, whether one is ultimately and deeply and profoundly loved, isn't up for grabs. And it feels to me as if that matters a great deal more than probably some individual propositions. I have to always feel like I have to keep saying, I like propositions. I argue for propositions, but I don't want to confuse people about the role that I think those ought to play in our lives. And so, when I think about love, therefore, as the central category here, I want to think about that in relation, certainly, to what real lives in this world look like, and certainly not as again some kind of path out of the world. So I don't want to speak to the uh, the situation in Ireland with more kind of glibness or confidence than is warranted. I mean, I have some idea where things are there, but not, I'm sure, nearly enough. So when I listen to, I mean, I want to just listen to what you have to say and learn from you there. But I think I certainly know that's a context in which religious belief has been given a tremendous amount of importance in various kinds of political struggle, but often has just seemed to be toxic and has been an occasion for violence and exclusion. And I want to have a variety of Christian belief that is genuinely, ecumenically, confidently orthodox, but that doesn't treat orthodoxy as a way of, again, kind of getting the golden ticket by getting the propositions right. The propositions ought to be right, but the point is, I think, to embrace a vision of divine love that precisely isn't exclusionary and violent. So yeah.
No, I'm into that. I think that's a good lesson for here as well as anywhere, Gary. And I want to go back to what I mentioned before. I mentioned this, I've been encouraged by this greater emphasis in some places your work, and I mentioned fact check and folks like that on Eros, Agape, things like that from a distinct Christian perspective. And I'm wondering why that is important to have a clear appreciation of these as Christians, I suppose, especially in an age of PR and these secular liturgies where our desires are formed for us and sold to us as authentically ours and as part of this expressive individualism, as if we can't have aberrant desires or the market's not creating these desires for us and so on. I wonder if you might speak to that.
So I think it's, there's a lot to say there, and maybe we ought to talk more about that. I think there certainly are secular liturgies. I think that's a great phrase. I'm not sure about the history behind that phrase. It feels like something that Bill Kavanaugh would have something to say about if he's somebody you've
Him
read
and
him.
James K. Smith, I got to say, I'm thinking of when I use that phrase oftentimes.
Yeah. And in the nature of the case, you look, none of us arrives in the world kind of fully formed. Right. I mean, I think we're Lockean blank slates precisely. I think there are dispositions and so forth that are there when we put in an appearance. But obviously, the practices in which we engage, the habits we learn, whether we learn them from families, whether we learn them from churches, from schools, whether we learn them from peers or we learn them, kind of in other settings out in the world, clearly make a difference. And I guess what I would say is the business of liturgy seems to me has always been about being intentional, right, on the part of the church. It's being intentional about shaping how people think and feel and experience, and being intentional about that in light of alternative as you say, secular liturgies that people also may participate in, sometimes unthinkingly, seems extraordinarily important for the church to take seriously. I mean, I think it's a little complicated, right? Because the sort of people who choose to participate in liturgy in the first place are probably people who are in general going to be more aware and more willing to be critical of what they're served up, in various contexts. So we have to recognize that, that liturgical formation isn't going to be equally effective for everybody, because a lot of people either won't participate or won't participate, on a consistent basis. But I think it's definitely right, as I try to suggest in multiple places. Again, one of those things that, there are particular people I've learned this from, but I wouldn't for a moment want to suggest that, it's in any way original with them or with me. The church has to be aware of ways in which it might welcome and ways in which it might push back against a range of trends in the wider culture. And liturgy has to be one of the key ways in which it makes possible a kind of critical engagement there. It's not simply creating a hermetically sealed world that's utterly disconnected. On the other hand, it's not about creating an utterly porous environment in which, the church simply, just becomes a kind of outpost of the wider culture. But instead, it has to be a kind of critical engagement with that culture in which what's valuable is embraced, and what's not so valuable is challenged and pushed back against. And it just seems to me liturgy is a useful, way of doing that.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Gary. So I'm going to give a lengthy spiel. I'm going to read this because otherwise I would have forgotten it. So those who are listening or watching, please forgive me. And Gary's going to have to be patient. So I want to frame this question in the kind of postmodern context. There's a lot of talk about power, and not, it seems to me, unlike the kind of crude reductionism in some ways of the Enlightenment, it's focused on this one-dimensional scientism. This now kind of dominant culture focuses maybe inordinately on power, failing to see multiple levels of reality. And I think it's hard maybe for people to see the truth and the way of the Christian faith beyond these kind of reductionist hermeneutics of suspicion, where everything's really about the will to power, everything's really about money, or everything's really about some psychological projection and so on. But I think your work suggests otherwise, and I wonder what is the nature of love and divine power from that Christian perspective, then, I suppose, in contrast to those stereotypes.
Wow. That's certainly a very interesting kind of framing of that. Right? I think so I don't want to be again unduly glib. And I often feel like the risk here is being glib in one way or another. First of all, I guess I want to say I think the talk about the the quote postmodern can take us in lots of different directions, and can sometimes do that in a way that is less than helpful, right? I think the reality is that I guess to say that power is omnipresent, I think runs the risk of just turning out to say nothing of great interest, right? That is, if everything is power, then is anything in particular power?
Mhm.
We might wonder about that. And so, this is a preface to what I want to say about divine power, but I always feel like I have to kind of toss this into the mix. So, you know, um, the person who's often invoked here the most is Michel Foucault, because so much of what Foucault did as a scholar focused on this sort of interplay between power and knowledge. And so, just to kind of complicate things, before I say something more about divine power, I feel like I need to introduce this bit from an interview from Foucault. And he says to the interviewer, "When I talk about power relations and games of truth, I am absolutely not saying that games of truth are just concealed power relations. That would be a horrible exaggeration. My problem is in understanding how truth games are set up and how they are connected with power relations. The medicalization of madness was connected with a whole series of social and economic processes, but also with institutions and practices of power. This fact in no way impugns the scientific validity or the therapeutic effectiveness of psychiatry. It does not endorse psychiatry, but neither does it invalidate it. Mathematics is linked to power structures, if only in the way it is taught. The way in which consensus among mathematicians is organized determines what is good, true, or bad, false in mathematics. This in no way means that mathematics is only a game of power, but that the game of truth of mathematics is linked in a certain way, without thereby being invalidated in any way to games and institutions of power. It is clear that in some cases these connections are such that one could write the entire history of mathematics without taking them into account. In any case, one simply cannot say that games of truth are nothing but games of power." And so Foucault goes on to say, when the interviewer talks about the way in which somebody who has the capacity to formulate truths also has power of being able to speak the truth, Foucault says, yes, and yet this does not mean that what the person says is not true, which is what most people believe. When you tell people that there may be a relationship between truth and power, they say, so it isn't truth after all. So I just feel like it's crucial to emphasize that Foucault, at any rate, I think, is much more aware of the nuance and complexity of what's being talked about there in this broader discourse about power. Now, you started by talking about the preeminence of talk about power in a lot of postmodern discourse, and then shifted to asking about divine power. So let me say something about the latter. As I observed before, I think that to believe in divine love is to believe that creation is real, and to believe that many of the things that happen in the created world happen contrary to God's intentions. So whatever conception of divine power we want to articulate has to be a conception of divine power in which the employment of that power doesn't somehow turn creation into something other than creation, turn creation into a puppet show. And so we can talk about, what that means. I mean, I think there are different ways of kind of cashing that out metaphysically. From a theological standpoint, I think what we want to say is just that there is a gap between divine love and what occurs in the created world. Sometimes what occurs realizes the intentions of divine love, and sometimes not. And then if we wanted to take that from a philosophical perspective, a couple of different ways we might think about it philosophically. But the point in any case is that whatever conception of divine power we want to operate with has to be a conception of divine power that's consistent with the observed reality that divine love is sometimes frustrated in the world. And so however we think about that, that I think has to be the premise from which we begin. So we can certainly say that the the reality of creation speaks to, profound divine power, and that divine love has to come to expression in what's going on in the world, or we just have a kind of detached deism that I think is inconsistent with belief in divine love. So again, as with what I said in another context, here too, I think there's a kind of dance between affirming, on the one hand, a sort of meticulous providence view that sees everything that happens as the product of divine providence, and I think that's a view that just turns God into the author of evil, or on the other hand, a kind of deistic detachment in accordance with which God is simply a kind of observer as things play out here. And I don't think either of those is a satisfactory view of divine power.
That's excellent, Gary. Thank you. And then, with that said, then what is the relationship between prayer and our life of prayer and this loving divine action that you're describing? And I suppose in some ways, how does that differ from cruder, more popular notions of prayer, maybe, and how God acts in history?
Yeah. So prayer poses an extra set of complexities when we're talking about petitionary prayer. Now, I think obviously, you know, prayer takes there are multiple dimensions to prayer, right? And so if we think about the prayer of thanksgiving, we think about the prayer of confession. I don't think these require any kind of sort of juggling of metaphysical complexities, particularly. But when we find ourselves engaged in petition, whether for ourselves or for others, so there's certainly the issue, as you note, about providential divine action in history, where the question is, can God be up to anything? But then there's the further complication. So, I think even once you've said, yes, here are some ways in which we can think reasonably about divine activity in the history of the created world, petitionary prayer poses a kind of further problem there, insofar as even if you think that there can be special providence, perhaps you think also there's miracle, even so, the question is, the best way to put this, how to square a conception of petitionary prayer with belief in divine love, insofar as you might well think, so suppose, for instance, I'm praying, God, I beg you, may Mark's lung cancer be healed. Well, so first of all, do you have an understanding of the world in which divine action can affect the state of Mark's lung cancer? But then, if the answer is yes, there's the further question, which is, well, then why isn't God doing that already? Why does God, what role would my prayer be playing there? Does that raise questions about divine love? Would we think, and even if people sometimes, I think, want to argue that there's some benefit to me spiritually in receiving certain things as gifts, and therefore it matters for God to not do certain things for me unless I ask. Maybe that's right, maybe it's not. I think we'd have to talk more about that. But obviously that's different from the case of kind of intercession, where we're talking about what's going on for somebody else, right? And it might well not seem to be ideal to say, well, God is is disinclined to do anything about Mark's lung cancer until I can receive God's action there as a gift. I mean, it doesn't seem quite good for Mark. So I guess what I've wanted to say about those sorts of prayers, I don't know that I regard as really ultimately as helpful as it might be. First of all, of course, those prayers are ways in which we open ourselves vulnerably to God, sharing what's on our hearts and what we really want to see happen. But perhaps in addition to that, and I think we want to be very modest in as regards what we say here. Perhaps in one way or another, there are, I'm speaking here at the, you know, the 40,000 foot level, there are connections between persons that are in one way or another opened up by our praying to the activity of divine providence, channels that wouldn't otherwise be there, so that our prayers provide in some way resources for activity to God that wouldn't be there otherwise. So, and I don't know what I mean when I say that. It's really just a kind of placeholder for something that probably requires further exploration. The philosopher H.H. Price, in his little book Essays in the Philosophy of Religion, has a chapter on petitionary prayer and telepathy, in which he tries to explore some of those possibilities. The contemporary philosophical theologian Marjorie Suhoki, in her book In God's Presence, which is a lovely little book about prayer, which talks about a number of things other than this issue, but again, sort of gestures, I think, in the direction of how our connections in one way or another might, with each other, at a deep metaphysical level, might be opened up to providential use. I think those are possibilities, and I think they're worth further reflection. I certainly don't feel like I've got some kind of clear account to offer. I want to be humble and modest here.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Gary, and appreciate that your demonstration of what it means to wrestle with those questions. I think that's important. I want to speak next about, like we mentioned before, that kind of dichotomization between eros and agape, and where that's went awry. There's also in many places, unfortunately, this crude dichotomy between nature and supernature.
Yes.
It's been lamented by, I think, your friend David Bentley Hart and folks like that, and Nancy Piercy, who I like. I don't think it's properly Christian, that dichotomy. You point to this loving creator then, I suppose, in contrast in some ways, and how we might love God in the creation. I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit and how that relates to things, I suppose, like science from a healthier perspective.
Sure. I mean, boy, there's so much to say there, and I don't, I would not propose to second guess, David Hart about many things. And while I'm honored to, I guess know him as an acquaintance, whether he'd regard me as a friend, I'm not sure. But I think, in my book Loving Creation, I revisit this topic of nature and grace a bit. Fundamentally, I think to believe in creation is to believe that God is always everywhere, already present and active, and divine action is always the action of divine love. And if that's right, then the idea that there could even in principle be an ungraced nature seems to me a mistake, right? It just seems like, that is God, grace is another word for certainly another aspect of divine love. Divine love is always present and active. There couldn't be creation without divine action. There couldn't be creation without divine love. Wherever there is creation, there is divine love. Therefore, there is grace. We can, somebody might try to abstract that away, but it would be a highly unrealistic abstraction if one believes in God as creator. Grace is always there, and it seems to me that we encounter God in and through our encounters with creation for the simple reason that we're not God. We can't, as it were, kind of vault out of the created world. The only kind of knowledge, the only kind of experience we can have is experience within the terms of the created world. And that doesn't mean that we can't recognize as an aspect of our experience of the created world, an aspect, the aspect of that world's having, and this is Ronner probably, but other people use this language too, Marshall maybe, the idea of a horizon, the kind of infinite horizon for the finite world, that is the presence and activity of God. But one thing that's definitely not the case, right, is that God is, a kind of, I think Nicholas Lash here, a big friendly part of the universe, right? God isn't another creature. And so if that's right, if we're going to encounter God, it's not going to be because we come around the corner and over the horizon, as Ronner used to say, there's Australia, right? And as if somehow we come around the corner, there's God over there. That can't be what it is, for any either classical or neoclassical conception of God. So if we're going to encounter God, it's going to be in and through our lives in the created world, because that's the only kind of activity and experience we as finite creatures can have. And so, you mentioned science in particular. I mean, I think, science is a profoundly spiritual practice when it's done right. And what I mean by that is that to engage in scientific inquiry is first and foremost to recognize my own deep finitude, right? I have to be constantly reminded, if I'm doing science, that I am a finite, fallible creature who stands in need of constant correction by encountering reality, right? And that I need to I bump into the harsh rock of reality over and over again, and I'm reminded that my ego, my desires, my perceptions, I don't control reality. It's not the only way. And so that's, it's a constant reminder that I'm a creature, even if I don't thematize the point that way, even if I don't, use that language. It's also, of course, something that matters in other ways. I think Alfred North Whitehead did important work in this area. Later historians of science have talked about this, the way in which the emergence of scientific practice finally makes sense in a context in which people believe that the created world is real, the created world is valuable, the created world is orderly, the created world is capable of being discovered and investigated, things that are seen to flow from, to be consonant with, but also, I think, often to be directly dependent on belief in divine creative activity. And these are all, of course, all beliefs that are central to scientific practice. So I think, as we know, for a host of reasons, some of them probably contingent, historical, bits of randomness, and sometimes not at all, sometimes, much deeper in their significance. Religious belief and scientific practice and inquiry have, often butted heads, especially in the last couple of 100 years. And I don't think we should, paper over that. But at the same time, I think we should recognize the way in which scientific practice can both be an affirmation of our creatureliness and an affirmation of the reality, value, and order of the created world.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you, Gary. And another thing I wanted to ask you about was, in contrast to this, popular notion in some quarters of like a zero-sum game, so to speak, where if you focus on the human, that's at the expense of creation and so on. There's this fluctuation, it seems to me, in popular culture in some places between antinatalism on one side and kind of transhumanism on the other. I wonder what then is the distinct shape of flourishing in a Christian framework in contrast to maybe either of those?
Interesting. So I want to be careful here again, because I think probably there are issues that I would need to have thought more about than realistically I probably have to say really really wise things here. My own conception of flourishing, I will say, has been profoundly influenced, I think, by one strand of the thinking rooted in the work of Thomas Aquinas and farther back than to Aristotle, where the idea, I guess, is that flourishing means something like the unfolding of our created potential. And I think that's compatible in principle with a potential to do some very transformative things, and so that's probably the truth on the transhumanist side. But on the other hand, I think just a recognition that we do really have the characteristics we do. When you think about unfolding this potential, it's not a potential to do absolutely anything under any and all circumstances. We can indeed flourish and thrive in exciting and new and creative ways. What we do as individuals, how we interact in societal contexts, can be unexpected and new. And yet at the same time, if we're thinking about the unfolding of the actual potentialities that we've got, we have some potentialities and not, I would think, others. So, I think one of the projects that I've kind of tried to undertake in that regard has been to try to think together what's been often a sort of Protestant emphasis on love at the heart of Christian ethics, with a Catholic emphasis on natural law, and to suggest that these are really very compatible. And they're compatible because love is best understood, I think, as appropriate regard for flourishing, and the content of flourishing is given by the way in which we've been created. And so there's a kind of bridge then between talk about love on the one hand and talk about natural law on the other. That doesn't mean a kind of version of natural law that seems, as I think some varieties of natural law thinking do, to freeze in place current social arrangements. We know exactly, that, how women ought to behave, or how, exactly what we ought to say about this or that aspect of, biomedical ethics or sexuality, something like that. On the other hand, while we certainly recognize there can be surprises, the surprises are for creatures like us, not creatures who are utterly different from ourselves. On the other hand, I think the Protestant approach, the approach that's centered on love, has sometimes kind of been disconnected from any substantive account of flourishing, and has just turned sometimes into a sort of baptized version of utilitarianism. And I think that's been profoundly unhelpful too. So maybe this is really the theme of our conversation. I feel like, once again, what matters is noting some ditches, or perhaps even abysses, on alternate sides of the road, and trying to walk between them.
That's powerful. I love that image too. Thank you, Gary. And I love your image of the dance. I think that's a nice one.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you next about something that's been a real blessing to me since I became a believing Christian. I've been blown away by this space that's opened for rest and for leisure and things like that. There are different things in some cases, obviously,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
going beyond that kind of overly rationalistic framework that maybe many of us have. So, with that said, I think that applies at the individual level and the societal level with things like the Sabbath. So, I wonder what role does the Sabbath and creative love have to play in a good Christian life, then, that personal, more corporate level? Then?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I've learned so much from so many very wise people about the experience and practice of Sabbath. And I don't think anything that I say is probably particularly original there. Um, you know, I think yeah, again, let me just give a shout out here to people like my revered and recently unfortunately deceased teacher Fritz Guy, to people like from whom he learned, like Karl Barth and Abraham Joshua Heschel, the leading conservative rabbi from mid-century. Um, More recently, Walter Brueggemann has written about Sabbath as resistance. There's just a great deal of really rich thinking that's gone on here, and I've tried in several different places to think about this. I'm sure inadequately, but I think the idea is one that Christians have recognized in various times and places, reappropriated, and I benefited certainly from growing up in a religious tradition that took this very seriously and put it on my agenda in a way that I think I wouldn't have experienced probably if I'd been in some other context. But the idea fundamentally, I think, is that we are driven very often by a desire to produce and achieve, and by a kind of anxiety that comes along with that, that's linked with a sense that we're not really doing what we need to do unless we're getting something done.
Mm.
And it seems to me that a really profoundly important insight encapsulated in the practice of Sabbath and the idea of weekly rest is that work doesn't define us. Not that work is bad. Work is indeed part of participating in the ongoing creative activity of God. Work is a good thing, but it doesn't make us who we are, and it's not definitive of our value as persons. And so the very fine Christian ethicist Marva Dawn, in a book about Sabbath, that she captures some of this in the subtitle, which describes the four segments of her book. What is it? Ceasing, resting, feasting, and embracing. And with the idea that just letting go of the need to produce, and experiencing rest, actively worshiping, and in the context of worship, celebration matters, and immersing ourselves in the Christian story matters. And I find myself reflecting on the inadequacy with which I've done some of those things over time. But I think Sabbath creates each week a sort of new invitation to do that, and to therefore step outside the rat race in a way that I certainly find very helpful.
That's lovely, Gary. Thank you. And in your work, you write about disordered love in a way that I think avoids some of those pitfalls or ditches that we mentioned with abuses of sin language in church and so on. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about that and the God of love who can guide us safely away from some of those ditches then.
Sure. So I think the idea that sin is a disorder of love is, of course, an idea that comes to very powerful expression in Augustine. It's certainly not new to me by any means, but I think uh, one thing it seems to me we ought to try to avoid, and this comes back to what you highlighted earlier regarding nature and grace. We ought to avoid this idea that sin is something that is, inconsistent with some sort of arbitrary, divine edict. It's the kind of thing that, as someone I know used to like to put it, that makes God mad. It's the image of God as a kind of erratically angry parent, sort of in view there. And I think when people grow up thinking about sin that way, um, it becomes very easy for them to say, well, why should I be interested in that? Why should I care about that? Isn't this really just a way in which some oppressive institution wants to tell me what not to do? And I think that's really, really unhelpful. What I think we ought to think about instead is the recognition that we can misdirect um, our love in one way or another. And the point, the created world, uh, is full of opportunities uh, for love that's rightly ordered. And the point is not to somehow vault out of the world and try to not love the world, not in the sense in which, say the Epistle of James talks about, love not the world, which means I think something like the kingdom of evil, but the created order, I think is well worth inspecting for the many opportunities for love it offers. But what we can't do, it seems to me, maybe this is the simplest way to put a point that needs a lot of elaboration, is to treat any finite reality as if it were absolute in value, as if it were infinite. Um, and that's not because, as it were, we might expect to somehow offend a kind of insecure God who doesn't like competing with creation for attention. Rather, the idea is that no created good, because no created good is in fact infinite, no created good can bear the weight that we place on it if we treat it as infinite. And if I ask my wife, say, for instance, to be perfectly loving and to be an absolutely secure ground of my existence all the time, that's basically just going to crush her under my expectations, and if I expect that a given, say, social institution, can guarantee the meaning of my life, then I'm going to be tempted to engage in, injustice with respect to those who are outside the reach of that institution, say a political entity or something like that, in order to maintain the claims of that. It's Reinhold Niebuhr, who of course was very much an Augustinian in this regard, but Reinhold Niebuhr liked to talk about the way in which, people would do things on behalf of institutions that they would never do for themselves. They would recognize that's profoundly unjust if I do that for myself, but they might think, well, but I'm acting in a generous and totally fair, indeed, way, if I do this on behalf of an institution, when in fact what I'm doing is just a kind of collective injustice rather than an individual instance of unfairness. And so I think the heart here of good lives, I think, of living a good life, is recognizing, with respect to oneself and any other whom one encounters, any other creature, but let's say this about oneself, one is a part of the good creation. So on the one hand, the creation is good, it's valuable. So if I'm part of it, that means that I'm not simply to be written off or treated as insignificant. On the other hand, I'm part of it. I'm not all of it. I'm not infinite, and I don't therefore have the ability to somehow trump all of the claims of anyone else. I don't, I don't get to behave arbitrarily, unfairly, unjustly, whatever you will, in relation to anyone else, because I'm not somehow sort of infinitely valuable in relation to these other supposedly insignificant others. And so a vision of love that is satisfactory, I think, is going to be one in which we recognize our own value and at the same time recognize that we're not the only valuable realities, that we engage with others who are also valuable and who deserve the various kinds of love that we might offer in given cases, anything all the way from respect all the way to devotion. So disordered love treats oneself or some group that one embraces in one way or another, some institution, as if it were infinitely valuable. Ordered love, I think, recognizes that created reality is created reality, valuable but finite.
That's excellent. Thank you, Gary. And another element of your work that I want to focus on is, like you've mentioned Rahner a few times in this conversation, and I've greatly appreciated one thing about him, that there's that openness to the world properly understood, and the good news of Christ's presence in history is good news for everyone. It's not bad news for Buddhists and all this kind of stuff. I wonder if you might speak that, suppose, in the context where you've lent into this God of history at the heart of Christian faith, and you do focus on the particularity of Jesus' life, death, and his resurrection. Can you speak to that and why it's vital for our understanding and appreciation of love then?
Yeah, so I think here's another kind of set of tensions, and in the second edition of Analogy, I ended up devoting a separate chapter to this question of how we kind of navigate issues related to difference, which I kind of treat in the first edition, but not in a separate chapter. So different historical trajectories are evident, right, with respect to different religious and cultural traditions. And really, I think a religious tradition just is a cultural tradition. And so it would be surprising, right, if we found, as I think some people on what seemed to me to be finally inadequate a priori grounds tend to think that we'd find everybody saying the same thing. People believe different things, their practices are different across different traditions, and you find, I think there's an attitude sometimes among people who have been immersed in the Abrahamic traditions and the Western monotheisms of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, to think that Eastern, in the broad sense, traditions are, inclusive and loosey-goosey and lack somehow what they feel is the kind of overly rigid, exclusive attitudes of Western thinkers and traditions. And I think that's just not right. It's not. It reflects, I think, a really superficial engagement with Western thinkers. I remember one Buddhist thinker whom I cite somewhere in the book, is it Dogen, who says, anybody who claims that these three different traditions, I think he's talking about what Buddhism and Confucianism, and I don't know what the third option is, are really all saying the same thing, is saying something that's worse than the babbling of babies. And the idea is that different developed traditions really do offer different understandings of the world, let's say at the kind of metaphysical level. They offer different ethical models, and often different socio-political models. And this is something that I really appreciated the chance to learn from John Milbank about years ago in a very incisive little essay called "The End of Dialogue." I think to believe in God as creator is to believe that divine presence and activity lie at the root of everything. To believe in God as logos is to believe that God, the God we see incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth is at the same time the true light that enlightens everyone, as John 1 says. And so, and to believe that God is spirit is to believe, certainly in the spirit who blows where the spirit wills and can't be kind of tied down to a particular district of history or experience. And so we start out there, I think, recognizing that there's divine presence and activity everywhere, and that it's a profound mistake to think that only we have some kind of lock on divine grace and divine presence. That's got to be wrong. But what we can't say, on the other hand, is that the differences don't matter. So I think the different historical trajectories, as I say, take place. Different kinds of developments happen, and I think those developments happen at every level in terms of how people understand the world, how they live in the world as individuals, how they live in the world as participants in institutions and patterns of social life. What I would want to say is it's at that level that we ought to be having the relevant conversations. The conversations are not about is my God, a sort of mean, nasty, tribal deity who's going to condemn you to eternal torment because you, don't really understand the Chalcedonian definition. You, participant in this other religious tradition that's very rich and very sophisticated, are just going to be dismissed because you don't share these views. I think you can have conversations about a whole range of issues, as long as you recognize that the differences are real, but they're not differences about whether God is present in people's lives, and they're not differences about who God loves and embraces. And, then I think we just have to go on from there to talk, the devil's in the details, right? We've got to talk about the very specific kinds of disagreements that there might be across religious traditions. We can talk about those, about how they play out existentially and ethically and politically. We just don't, I think, want to do it in a way that suggests that there's any kind of stingy constraint on the universal embrace of divine love. I mean, that's the sort of thing I'd want to take away from Rahner, that grace is universal. That doesn't mean that, again, doesn't mean you ignore the differences or think they don't matter, but what they don't matter for, I think, is what you have to keep firmly in view. And what they don't matter for is in limiting the sweep of God's grace.
Man, thanks for that, Gary. And it's funny, my little sister, she's only 14, she was asking me about this topic yesterday, so we'd have to show her this interview, maybe even this portion of the interview, which is not going to sit through the whole thing. But so I think that's where the rubber meets the road, as they say. People are asking those questions. It's something very real for a lot of young people, especially, I suppose, in some ways. So next, I wanted to ask you if you're happy to continue for another while.
Probably time to start winding down, but let's if you got another question, I'm happy to
Okay,
engage.
yeah, we can close it shortly afterwards then. So in some ways, like Eugen Rosenstock, who I've been reading a lot recently and appreciating greatly. I think you show the importance of love and life beyond death, both in that kind of more visceral sense of the rotten corpse and then the death of our egotism and so on. That's something that Rosenstock leads into as well. I wonder if you might speak to this and Jesus' life beyond death and what that means for our lives of love.
Yeah, so you really have been a very careful reader of the book, and you've touched certainly on a number of themes that have been very important there. I think it is inconceivable that we would be having this conversation if the earliest Christians had not been absolutely convinced that some subset of them had encountered Jesus alive and glorified after his death. That seems really clear. I mean, I think there's a whole host of kind of prophetic movements and so forth within Judaism that we know about. Prophets die, and so forth. You can certainly imagine that in a prophetic role, playing a prophetic role, Jesus would have had an impact that we'd still be aware of, just as other, say, prophets within Judaism had impacts, and as we see similar figures having impacts within other traditions. What you wouldn't have was the emergence of anything like what we recognize as Christianity. It's clear that the earliest Christians, both the apostles, the original surviving 12, survivors of the 12, other than the Judas, and St. Paul as well, clearly understood themselves to have personally encountered Jesus alive and glorified after his death. His aliveness amounted to a kind of vindication, that his crucifixion didn't have the last word. Rome wasn't right. He had been innocent. And the glorification that was also part of the experience clearly then signaled for them that the sort of claim to authority that had been part of what he had said. He wasn't, calling attention to himself as a preacher in general, but a claim to authority that was nonetheless presupposed by the way he spoke and what he said, was sort of expressed in, a kind of worthiness for worship that would have, I think, otherwise been very difficult for anybody in first century Judaism to take seriously. That set of experiences, it seems to me, obviously pointed the earliest Christians toward belief in life beyond death. It's not that there wasn't this kind of belief in both in the Hellenistic world and also in Judaism itself. But I think we also know that in first century Judaism, there seem to have been lots of different options in view. There were apparently some folks who really did just believe that there was no life beyond death. There were folks who believed in reincarnation and so forth. But here was a kind of definitive statement as far as the early Christians were concerned as regards which way to go in those disputes. There was, Jesus himself, at any rate, experienced. They experienced him as living personally beyond death. And I think, so what might that mean? Well, so one thing obviously is that it focused the earliest Christians and the rest of us on a conception of life beyond death as personal. In addition, as I say, there was this idea, it seems to me, of vindication that undermined the claims of, say, of Rome to be good at doing justice, if in fact, I mean, you might, I guess, try to weasel out of this, but it seems to me an obvious reading here is that what we see is Jesus the innocent victim and Rome as the oppressor. So that's a serious issue. So that not only is there hope for individuals, but there's also a kind of judgment on the would-be judges of Jesus and on institutions like theirs throughout history. The solidarity of Jesus then with other victims is highlighted in that context as well. So I think you've got, I'm sure, lots of other things, but I mean, this is a way of pointing toward hope for us beyond death, and at the same time, hope for historical transformation, insofar as there's a transvaluation of values, to use Nietzsche's phrase, with respect, I think, to those in power and those they victimize.
Amen. I think that is a good place to finish for this conversation. And just finally, then, where can my viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work then, Gary?
Sure. So you can definitely check out GaryChartier.net or .com, my website, which provides a bunch of books and a contact form and so forth. It's primarily designed to pitch a consulting practice that has yet to take off the ground, but that certainly still might be a natural enough way to connect. And certainly happy to hear from people if they want to check in about things I've written or things I've had to say. I'm honored by this much for engaging.
Thank you, Gary, and God bless you in your work. Appreciate it.